Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Season 3, Episode 8 of American Gods. So, this is what is to be the season finale of Episode 3, and I say it like that just because I honestly don't exactly feel that this series finale feels like a series finale for the most part. It just kind of feels like another kind of just like there was portions of this episode that was really kind of stretching for time. There is a whole kind of party, let's just say in a very cryptic like sense, that ultimately is to be milked out for time. It's quite obvious. There are really just within this episode, most of the stuff that is going on here is just reasonably all of still like transitional stuff. Like, hey, we didn't get to this character, so let's kind of make an entire episode about them. Hey, we haven't had enough time with this character yet. We haven't marinated on this character yet. Like, it kind of feels like almost Shadow Moon, even though he's in this episode, he's kind of a non-existent character, which is hilarious because technically isn't he the main character? We have it to where we have very much figured out exactly who is going to be on Odin's side, and that is basically no one at this point. We really have it to where at the very tail end of this episode, like Odin is going to have nobody working for him at this point or the next, because when looking at it, every single time that I am seeing someone on Odin's side, well, it's so goofy, it's so ridiculous how reasonably there is no real legitimate, like, I guess there is and I have to kind of do this cryptically, but I gotta give people some interest about this episode. There is a battle to go on, there is a fight to go on in this episode, but it is not of war quality, and reasonably when looking at it, the fight kind of feels very clunky, and like the fight scene just feels very goofy and or clunky to where it just just doesn't quite, like, there's nothing about any of this stuff that kind of feels like of a high-end quality. It's just kind of like, hey, well, we have to give people something, so this has got to be it. That's what it feels like this season 3 finale really and truly is. It's just the fact of like, well, we have to give people something, and so this is it. That is what I feel like this quality is to me within this series finale. Ultimately, when they immediately have like a flashbacking moment in the very beginning of the show, immediately I was like, oh my god, I was so terrified that I was right all along, that ultimately they were going to have this entire episode be a flashback thing, where ultimately it'd be a time period piece again for the entire episode, and they would have gotten to nothing and just either try to introduce somebody or something. Like, I was just kind of like, oh god, hold on. Brace for impact, because I was assuming that they were going to do yet another flashback episode, and I was going to be utterly mortified and or crushed by them going that route. When looking at the entire episode as a whole, this episode really doesn't accomplish much. It, as well as almost seemingly every episode. That's why a lot of people are just kind of really just kind of upset about these episodes, because everyone is realizing that they're really just milking the butter on this one. They're really just going and saying like, well, like, we're gonna try to make a 3-season show a 10-season show, so what should we do? Uh, and probably a lot of people would say it's like, well, I read the novel and they're about like, they're only going to have probably enough content for X amount of seasons. And so, but anyways, I really thought that this episode, compared to probably the rest of the season, was a okay at best episode. Was barely just scraping the bottom of the barrel of okay for this episode, to be brutally honest. So, ultimately, as per usual, uh, let's go into spoilers. It's otherwise justifiably crack down into that double five to otherwise go into this and ultimately get this review underway. So, reasonably now in spoiler time, it's about that time I'm going to spoil this episode. So, this entire episode is really cruxed on Laura and Salim. And that is pretty much it. That is, so ultimately, if you like that story, man, do I got a bargain for you. So, in the very beginning of this episode, we have a timeline. Also, when we finally in this episode get the name of the device that had otherwise supposedly retired Technical Boy earlier on. Ultimately, it is in all technicality, it is called Head Grabber. Wow. So at least if that thing keeps popping itself onto every episode, we now have the technical term for this thing called Head Grabber. Wow. All right. It could have been something technical. It could have been like VR set or something but anyways, it's just Head Grabber. Wow. That was the thing that was supposedly seemingly going to kill Technical Boy, but actually didn't do that at all. It just left him in suspended animation, which ultimately we'll see that in this episode. So, going into here, like I said, we have a timeline of 1951 to go back to have it show the history of a hotel that ultimately I don't care about. I don't care about in the fact like a setting of a thing, like setting up the setting of a story does not matter. It doesn't. But I did kind of like the visuals that were presented in this episode because at least it was different than anything else that they had done before. So I can applaud them for trying something different because they technically had to because they had to go this approach. So 1951, we ultimately have it to where seemingly we have a man running into a hotel. I don't know who this person is, and I don't know who the person behind the counter is either. And so ultimately we have it to where man runs into a hotel to ultimately say, hey, guys are after me, please help me. And so we immediately have the girl behind the counter ultimately saying, hey, here's a room, go into room 12. We ultimately end up having it to where we find out that a couple things. So we end up having these cops come in and say, hey, we're looking for this man. Ultimately, it seems that he has gone out of his way to seemingly be performing some kind of sex kind of activities and stuff along those lines that is against the law. Blah, 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 blah. I won't go into details because I don't want to use specific words and so on and so forth. So we have it to where we eventually find out that the girl behind the counter of this hotel of the Peacock Inn, you ultimately find out that one of the three police officers, she had a fling with or a makeout session with. The only thing of it is that this woman behind the counter wasn't always a woman. Dun dun dun. So we end up finding out that they are arresting this man for quite possibly performing the exact same acts of one of their quite possible police officers. And so ultimately, we have it to where reasonably this girl behind the counter is using the fact that, like, hey, like, if anything, you're going to take my word that ultimately this guy who you are otherwise looking for is not here, or otherwise I'm going to spill the beans on one of your on kind of one of your people. That's not exactly what she says, but like she kind of like says it by looking at a certain detective that is ultimately just like, yeah, I'm gonna rat you out if you want. So we end up having it to where evidently this evidently this girl was named Tony at some point. I don't know if that's actually her name, but that's what the detective keeps muttering is the word Tony. So technically, I guess I could call her Tony, but I'm not exactly sure if that is exactly her name. Um, so going on to this, the cops are forcibly left to leave because there is no real true evidence that this man had been here, and so we end up having it to where Tony ends up going and helping this guy who is otherwise running from the law, ultimately going and trying to give him food and all kinds of like, hey, like I'm gonna give you a meal and then you can head on your way. So we eventually have it to where this guy appreciates the very nice gesture that ultimately this woman had bestowed upon him. And so we end up having it to where this man decides, like, hey, like, I'm going to make your life like ever prosperous and as well as mine will be. And so and so on and so forth, all these nice gestures, these nice exchanges and stuff like that, ultimately telling that this girl will have like a wonderful rest of her life because when looking at it, like she had bestowed a kindness to him. So we end up having this guy ultimately approaching the sign of the Peacock Inn, and here's where we get a little bit of odd things going on. We end up having it to where this guy otherwise is blowing out butterflies out of his mouth repetitiously. Just butterflies upon butterflies coming out of his mouth. Kind of like if you ever seen the Stephen King movie Green Mile, where we had like the big Michael Clark Duncan, who ultimately was kind of shooting out like flies or whatever out of his mouth. It's same thing. So we end up having this guy just blah, 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 all these butterflies out of his mouth, which ultimately this all of these butterflies is to otherwise have a peacock visual that is to otherwise appear upon this sign. I guess as a symbol of sorts for them to be able to house a certain kind of people, which ultimately is pretty much all people that were I were to assess either are people that look like fairies or are fairies, because it seems like this is where all the either fairies or leprechaunish people all congregate and meet is all at this inn. So that is a flashback for to ultimately set up a setting, which ultimately I was like, okay, I don't exactly quite understand why we needed a backstory for the setting. But by golly, I guess we just had to. So I guess it was just kind of like a morality story. They had to kind of like put that in there as just like, well, like we had to represent a certain kind of thing, and that's perfectly fine. Um, I just didn't know how it really helps the story, but it help us with. Anyways, going on to here. So we ultimately have it to where Laura and Salim are supposed to go to this inn. I think really I'm probably gonna focus on the Laura and Salim stuff, and then kind of focus on everything else because because really, like, the Salim and Laura thing are the main story, and everything else is just kind of like an afterthought, with the exception of what goes on with Tyrell and Odin in this episode. So we end up having it uh, to where Laura and Salim are to ultimately go into this inn, and it seems that ultimately Laura is still grieving on the loss of Mad Sweeney, and ultimately we have it to where I'm like, oh, okay, well, they should just be able to, like, considering she's with like all these fairies and leprechauns and whatever, like, so they should have probably enough magic to bring him back to life, right? No. So reasonably we just have it to where ultimately we have Laura, who is supposedly still dealing with the loss of Mad Sweeney, and ultimately Salim is kind of calling her out on that. Ultimately having it to where we end up finding out that Salim is going to his room to ultimately find out that his bed is repetitiously shaking, to where it seems that one of the guys that is otherwise for this hotel is a repairman, and ultimately ends up fixing the bed as well as seemingly fixing Salim up to go to some party, because ultimately it seems like both of them are ultimately really interested in one another, and it seems that ultimately Salim has to get over the hump in a non-joking manner, get over the hump of a djinn by getting into another scenario with another man. Ultimately, is basically what happens in this episode. So we end up having it to where Laura is to go, and ultimately we end up finding out that this inn, several decades later, ultimately still has the same girl, Tony, from the 1950s. So we were just to assess that this girl had probably been able to not age from that time to this. And so we ultimately have it to where Laura is to go to the bartender of this inn. And so we end up finding out that she has to go and, like, exchange something for the spear. We end up having it to where Laura has to explain to this bartender that ultimately, like, hey, like, I'm a friend of Mad Sweeney's. Ultimately, I had been called by Mr. World to ultimately get the spear, so give me that spear. We ultimately have it to where the bartender ended up saying, like, well, that'd be great if ultimately I could get Mad Sweeney's coin, because ultimately if you have it, I want it. And so we end up having it to where Laura is going back to Salim and ultimately telling him, it's like, well, we can get the spear, but it'll cost me the coin, and who knows if this guy is ultimately going to deliver on the promise that he is going to have. Meaning, more than likely, this guy could take the coin, take the spear, and, like, I'll never hear from him again. So we ultimately have it to where Salim is really ultimately mentioning to Laura, it's like, well, I really understand, like, what you're debating, but when really looking at it, like, I think that coin really represents you having to let go of Mad Sweeney. That's what's really going on here. That's the reason why you won't easily give up the coin to get the spear. But I also am just like, well, isn't that coin lucky? Like, wouldn't you rather want a lucky coin than a weapon that, how exactly are you going to have the power to yield against a god? I don't know. I'm assuming or assessing that either Laura or Salim are probably going to die trying to take out Odin, and the journey will go on. Like, I just have a feeling that Laura or Salim on their journey to going and killing Odin is just going to be all for naught. When really looking at it, we're ending up having to where Laura is like, well, I don't think I can give up the coin, but if we don't give up the coin and get the spear, we'll be breaking the promise to Mr. World, and then ultimately Shadow Moon, Laura, and Salim might be in danger to ultimately be killed because they broke this promise. So we end up having it to where Laura ends up just deciding to give up the coin to the bartender. The bartender ends up vanishing because ultimately Laura is to assume that, oh, I can just go with you. And the bartender's like, no, that's not how it works. So we end up having it to where the bartender ends up leaving and Laura thinks she's ended up getting swindled by this guy. So we end up having it to where later on down the road, we end up having to where the bartender just appears out of nowhere and he's like, oh my god, I got you your spear. And so we end up having it to where Laura is, of course, with Odin's spear, and she's just like tossing it on her back, and she's just kind of just walking around with this giant spear like it's nothing. It's like, dude, if anybody knows what that is, like, wouldn't they be on their way to kill you or whoever you are with? So now we ultimately have it to where it seems that the spear was the only thing that they had to accomplish in being in this inn. So we ultimately have it to where Salim is ultimately questioning whether he should go to this party or not. This, I would assess, kind of fairy themed like party, and so we end up having it to where ultimately he is kind of really like, I'm not quite sure if I want to go to this party, and we ultimately have it to where Tony ends up meeting with him and ultimately mentioning excuse me, ultimately mentioning it's like, well, like, are you not going to this party because you kind of feel ashamed? Like, are you going to this party because like you aren't quite as open as you are led to believe, kind of thing? And so we end up having it to where Salim is otherwise going like, well, like, no, like maybe I'm not. So we end up having it to where Salim ends up going and accompanying Tony to this party, and so we eventually have it to where there is seemingly an SEX debacle going on in here because ultimately that is a stretch. Like, I was kind of timing it out to see how long that this party was to go on for, to just kind of see how much things were to get eaten up, because it seems like there was like I was really timing this episode to just see like, okay, how long is this episode and how long are they kind of taking for everything? It kind of feels like the very opening scene took like 10 minutes, and so I was like, okay, so they have about like about a window of like 40 more minutes, and I think like this whole party that ultimately Salim had went to probably took about maybe 20 minutes. And so I was like, okay, so this is about a 40 to 50 minute show, and we have 30 minutes that are otherwise tied to the opening scene, and this party is like 20 minutes, that's 30. So we have about like 10 to 20 minutes ballparkingly of real actual story going on. And so it's just kind of like, okay, this is a goofy season. So reasonably, that is what is bottled and accomplished within the Salim Laura story. Eventually, we have it to where, like, towards the very tail end of this episode, we end up seeing Salim ultimately praying to Mecca, and that's how the episode just tailors off with him putting on his hat and praying to Mecca. But that's not all that I'm going to talk about here. So that's the main story. Here's all the other side pieces. So we ultimately have it to where Technical Boy is glitching out. So we end up having to where Miss World, because ultimately we have to hot dog around with this character. And now we are back to Miss World. And so Miss World decides to be able to figure out the best way to take care of Technical Boy is to uh, put the head grabber on him and to ultimately have him sort himself out, I guess. So we end up having Technical Boy in this technical oasis of him in this head grabber like area. And so we have Technical Boy, who is because I'm kind of saving the Shadow Moon Odin part for very last because it's technically towards the tail end of this episode, anyways. So there we go. So we end up having it to where ultimately that Technical Boy eventually sees Bilquist, but it's not the actual God that he is used to seeing. Basically, Bilquist is honestly his consciousness. So we have it to our Bilquist consciousness, which isn't actually Bilquist. It looks like a mixture of Technical Boy and Bilquist. Like, basically, imagine if, like, Bilquist was Technical Boy. Like, she basically head to toe looks like Technical Boy. It's just the face of Bilquist. So we have it to our. I'll just call Bilquist consciousness. I'll just call her Technical Boy's consciousness. I'll just say consciousness consistently. So we end up having it to our Techno Boy is talking to his consciousness, and basically we end up having it to our Technical Boy is talking to consciousness, and he's ultimately like infuriated with her because it's like, dude, you basically sent me here, like you effed me up, and so consciousness is ultimately mentioning like, well, no, like if anything, I kind of released you, like I kind of opened you up more. I kind of brought to the surface stuff that you were already feeling, stuff that you were already like in your mind, like thinking. Like I kind of opened you up more. I kind of got you to be able to kind of very much like I guess kind of think on his own rather than just kind of be a drone that ultimately just does what people tell him to do, kind of thing. So we end up having it to where we find out that like Technical Boy has a God, what is it? The Disney equivalent of the little cricket guy, the little like he has a consciousness now, and so ultimately we have it to where reasonably like the consciousness is at some point kind of threatening Technical Boy at some points in time, but we have it to where Technical Boy is like, dude, you can't do anything to me here because when looking at it, this all isn't real. This is just an illusion or imagination or an alternate like it's basically just a thing that ultimately isn't really and truly going on. Like it's basically like a virtual reality headset where nothing is really actually happening to him. We have it to ultimately Technical Boy is consistently complaining about being or not being able to scratch his junk, and so we end up having it to where ultimately uh, his consciousness ends up threatening that he's going to like pull off his junk, and we end up having it to where Technical Boy ends up saying like, dude, none of this is real. Like none of like you're not going to be able to do anything, even if you have like uh, both your hands in a chainsaw. Like there's nothing you're going to do to me. So we end up having it to where this scene, while being interesting, like doesn't accomplish anything. Like a lot of this stuff with Technical Boy in this here accomplishes nothing. So it kind of feels like if we have a flashback, a Technical Boy moment, and a party, man, does this episode doesn't really get a ton accomplished. So really, that is to all what is to go on with Technical Boy. It's just kind of cuts of him kind of talking to his consciousness, which is ultimately displayed as Bilquist, and that's about a beef of what we really get into in this in this season, within this season finale show. So here is the real big beefy thing to otherwise end on here. So we end up having it to where Shadow Moon is with Tyrell, ultimately to go on a trip to ultimately go and seek Odin. So we end up having it to where Shadow Moon and Tyrell are in this car, and ultimately they are to get out to, I believe, go to a general store. And so you ultimately end up having it to where Tyrell is to give Shadow Moon coffee, and so Shadow Moon ends up taking the coffee and ends up realizing that the coffee is drugged. So he ends up starting to fall over, and he's like, "Oh mother, like dude, you drugged me." So we end up having Shadow Moon ending up falling over, and so ultimately we end up having some guy to otherwise go and say, "Hey, like something's wrong with your friend." Ultimately, we have it to where Tyrell ultimately says, "Oh, he's having a seizure," and so we end up having this guy who's perfectly timing or timed to ultimately say, "Well, hey, I'm an EMT, and that isn't a seizure." And we ultimately have it to where Tyrell ends up taking his hand and just jabbing this guy in the freaking throat as hard as he possibly can to like cut into his throat, and this guy ends up just falling over dead. Okay, so we end up having to where eventually, so Odin is to meet up with Tyrell, and we are ultimately to decide that I guess the dead carcass body that had been flying into seemingly Odin's car, and ultimately Johan, who had been killed, had all been from ultimately Tyrell, that I would assume had chosen a side, which is not the side of Odin. And so we end up having it to where these war gods ultimately get together and they are bickering it out. So we end up having it as a Mortal Kombat 2 like situation to where all of a sudden both of these guys are together, and they bizarrely end up changing into their war gear. We end up having it to where Odin uh, is in his armored gear, like it's all gold and sweet looking, and we end up having it to where Tyrell is in his war gear, and it's all like horns and all kinds of weird looking stuff. Like none of this, like it's basically just two guys in armor. Like there's no extra like CGI thing going on. None of these characters look different beyond just them just putting on armor and just trying to uh, slay and fillet one another. So it seems that Shadow Moon, while this battle is going on, it seems like he's getting up from this. And we eventually have it to where ultimately, when Tyrell seems to be getting the advantage on Odin, we end up having it to where Shadow Moon ends up grabbing Tyrell. And so we end up having it to where Tyrell turns and ultimately says, like for that discretion that you had pulled, like basically him interrupting this fight, that ultimately Shadow Moon is going to have to die as well, because ultimately it's like, well, hey, like you interrupted this fight, like if anything, like we were like fighting in honor and in honor code and whatever, and you disgrace that, so ultimately you're gonna die as well. But we end up, as Tyrell is talking to Shadow Moon, we ultimately have it to where Odin ends up getting the advantage and stabbing Tyrell through the back into the chest. So we end up having Tyrell falling to the ground, and ultimately that is to basically resolve this whole situation. And I'm just like, okay, I guess Tyrell had chosen the side of not being with Odin then, and we have it to where seemingly there is still not a war yet, but ultimately there are people still battling against each other. We have things going down so much into this that ultimately we're really having an actual battle finally. In after 3 seasons, we're having a legitimate battle of sorts. It's not a war, but it's just a battle between two people. And yeah, so we end up having it to where ultimately, like, Odin, who had a glass eye when he was Mr. Wednesday, when he changes to his gold armor and stuff, we end up having it to where his eye is just kind of like it has like a slit in it, and we end up seeing like the skin kind of like going around his eye, so it kind of looks different than the normal Mr. Wednesday than we're used to seeing. But other than that, there is kind of maybe like facial hair, and like there's very slight differences between Odin and Mr. Wednesday, as well as Tyrell and him being the other Tyrell dentist, whatever. So really, that is just the real conclusion of this episode, and I think I need to get out of here so ultimately I can kind of beat the time of which that this is reviewed. So yeah, that's all that really comes out of this episode. Some people may be disappointed. Some people might ultimately have liked this episode more than others, and so on and so forth. So people might have mixed feelings about this episode, but I'm going to get out of here. So goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.